Good morning from Utah Valley University Office for Global Engagement. I'm your host, Baldomero Lago, and I welcome you to Global Dialogues. During this session, feel free to ask questions in the Facebook comments window. If time permits, I will address a select few. Today, our distinguished guest is Mr. Ryan Koch. As a way of introduction, Mr. Koch oversees the operations for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints outreach to the diplomatic communities in New York and at the United Nations, including representing Latter-day Saints Charities, the church humanitarian arm. Ryan is also responsible for liaising with religious umbrella organizations in New York. Prior to his work for the church, Mr. Koch spent 11 years as a public diplomacy officer for the U.S. Department of State. During this time, he served abroad at the U.S. embassies in Manila, Philippines, Kiev, Ukraine, and his sweetheart country, Stockholm, Sweden. You'll have to tell us a little bit about Sweden and your relationship. Mr. Ryan, he's a good friend. We're honored to have you join us in this virtual setting all the way from New York City, or should I say New Jersey? I want to be friends with you. I mean, you live in New Jersey, and I believe you're now at New Jersey. Is that correct at this point?
Currently, I'm sitting in New Jersey, yes, but the office is still in New York. Excuse me.
We welcome you to our Global Dialogues this morning, and thank you very much for joining us. Ryan, tell us a little bit about it. What is LDS Charities, and how does it work with the United Nations?
So before I go into specifics about Latter-day Saint Charities and the relationship with the United Nations, I want to take a moment to talk about the role of diplomacy in general. So as you read in my introduction, I used to work for the US State Department and had a lot of really good, interesting experiences all around the world. My love for Sweden, by the way, comes because I served my LDS mission in Sweden. I then later did an internship in Sweden, served for 3 years at the embassy in Stockholm. One of my children was born in Sweden, so I have a lot of ties to that country. It's very near and dear to my heart. But in my first assignment in the Philippines, one of my mentors, she told me that the purpose of diplomacy, the role of diplomacy, is to get a country from point A to point B. Point A is where they are, and point B is where we want them to be. And when she told me that, I thought that that was very egotistical, egocentric, right? Like, what is this? We're deciding the outcome for every country in the world. And then I realized that that's the purpose of every country's diplomatic efforts, right? If Finland is working with Ethiopia, Finland is trying to get Ethiopia to where they want Ethiopia to be, but Ethiopia is also trying to get Finland to where they want to be. Every country is trying to make the world a better place. And diplomacy takes all of these efforts, and hopefully we can all go in a direction that's beneficial for all of us, okay? So working with the United Nations now, I am working there. So Latter-day Saint Charities, as you said, is the humanitarian organization of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and is accredited to the United Nations as a non-governmental organization, or part of the civil society space. And all the civil society actors, they are also trying to get countries from point A to point B, right? And so we all are trying to work together to go in this common direction that's going to be for the betterment of all. So Latter-day Saint Charities, well, before I even get there, background to Latter-day Saint Charities as the humanitarian arm, I think even very well-read members of the LDS faith have no clue and no idea the extent of the work that we do as a charitable organization. I mean, when there's a natural disaster, every once in a while we know that the helping hands, the yellow vests go in to help, et cetera, and we're like super proud, right? But there's millions and millions of dollars that are spent on humanitarian aid every year that we just don't know about, by and large. Why? Because we try to do our service quietly. We work together with myriad partner organizations, thousands of partner organizations. We've done projects in virtually every single country in the world. I think we're missing 3, but we're really trying to get out there, do good, and help people. And we do our work without regard to any kind of demographic factor, right? It doesn't matter your race, it doesn't matter your religion, it doesn't matter your sexual orientation. We are just trying to provide humanitarian aid and do good to people who need it. And at the same time, it's never a tit for tat, if you will. We never are requiring anything from our partners or from the countries that we do humanitarian aid in. It's simply because we are trying to fulfill our commitment to be like Christ and to serve people where they need to be. So Latter-day Saint Charities in the UN then, what we're trying to do really is to foster an environment where governments are more willing and able to work together with faith-based organizations. And so we work together with diplomats directly. We do a lot of outreach directly to the diplomatic corps, as well as get involved in various NGO committees here at the United Nations. So we work on issues of freedom of religion or belief or family issues. One of the big ones that I've worked with the last 18 months or so is called the Multi-Faith Advisory Council to the Interagency Task Force on Religion and Development. It's a very long name. It's very UNese. But basically, it's the first formal organization bringing together faith-based humanitarian aid actors in a policy and an advisory role. And I was really honored to be asked to be one of the initial members of that group. So really, it's trying to work together, advance the common good, and cooperate with people who might not necessarily think the way we do.
Interesting. So I see that you're working very closely with the United Nations. Why is the United Nations 2030 agenda relevant to your operations then?
So the 2030 agenda, or the Sustainable Development Goals, and Felipe talked a lot about that last week. It's the language of the United Nations right now. It's what the United Nations cares about. And so the 2030 agenda is relevant to us because if we don't work within the 2030 agenda, nobody's going to pay attention to us, right? But one of the things that I do is I wear my little pin, which is symbolizing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, as a way of showing that I am committed to trying to achieve a lot of those goals. If I can share a quick slide with you, let me share my screen briefly. This slide is simply to show that many of the Sustainable Development Goals work hand in hand with things that Latter-day Saint Charities is already doing. You know, trying to eliminate hunger, trying to eliminate poverty, trying to encourage education, trying to encourage peaceful societies. We're trying to do that already. And so really the Sustainable Development Goals is a way of talking about the projects we're doing already and to show our commitment to trying to accomplish the things that the United Nations is trying to accomplish. On a kind of a similar note, why the 2030 agenda is relevant, and I think really the 2030 agenda should be relevant to everybody. When people ask me about the work at the United Nations, they complain sometimes that the United Nations is just talk. And the thing that people don't realize often is the talk that happens in New York has a way of trickling down. So the language gets agreed upon here, and that language, those policies, they trickle down to national governments, which trickle down to state governments, which trickle down to your city governments, which trickle down to your schools, right? And many of the changes that you dislike, or maybe that you like, happen because of the talk that happens here in New York. And so the more we're trying to influence that talk, the better it is. So many of the changes that you might see happening are directly related to the 2030 agenda. And it might not say 2030 agenda, it might not say Sustainable Development Goals, but it all goes back to the 2030 agenda. And it's really one of the most landmark cases of all 193 countries coming together to agree on a way forward. And so we have 10 more years. It's now the decade of action to try to accomplish those goals, or at least get as close as we can to accomplishing them in the next 10 years. And so we're going to keep working on that.
You have indicated that LDS Charities, there's so much that they do, but then not too many individuals know about, I call it the silent giant, right? I mean, there's so much going on, but people don't understand, don't know. Would you mind sharing perhaps some highlights of the work that you do?
So the work that I do here, some of it has been visible, some of it has not been visible. But if people were to ask me, say, what am I most proud of in my time here? And I've been here for about 6 years. I think it's been the steady growth of the presence and the recognition and the cooperation that people are willing to have with our organization. If I can draw a parallel, so I've been here for about 6 years. I do have an internship program. Every semester, there's 2 interns. Right now, not really because of COVID, but usually every semester I've had 2 interns. And over the years, I've had a number of interns from UVU. They've been top notch. I've been really pleased to have worked with the UVU interns. I have a lot of UVU paraphernalia from over the years. In fact, for Halloween, I was a UVU student and I wore all my UVU paraphernalia. I needed a last minute costume. But the interns will ask me, what makes a good intern? And I say, well, enthusiasm. And at the beginning, you're going to get a bunch of grunt work, especially, but do that well and show me that you do that well. And then you'll get more responsibilities, more assignments, more meaty things to do. And the same is true for the United Nations. So over the last 6 years, when I've been trying to get involved and trying to get into a space, the first things are maybe not that exciting, but eventually there's bigger projects and more things and more recognition from both Salt Lake City and here in New York. So if I can share a couple more slides, let me share my screen again. In 2016, there was what's called the Commission on the Status of Women, and we were able to pull together a panel for that commission talking about the role of faith-based organizations in promoting and fostering leadership skills in young women and girls. Sister Neil Marriott, who at the time was in the Young Women General Presidency, was tapped to come out and speak on that panel. And it was a good panel. But because she did that, in 2017, I actually worked together with Felipe's office, and we were able to do a very large briefing. Wait. Let me get this. We were able to do a very large briefing called the Focus on Faith briefing. Sister Jean Bingham, who is the General Relief Society president currently, had just been called. She had only been a week on the job as the General Relief Society president. Her first assignment was to come to the United Nations and to speak to a room of 450 people, which she did very, very admirably. It drew a lot of attention to the work of Latter-day Saint Charities, but not just the work of Latter-day Saint Charities, but the work of faith-based organizations in general and our partnerships. So a couple other people in this picture, we have Anwar Khan here, who at the time was the CEO of Islamic Relief USA, comes to find out that Latter-day Saint Charities was their first interfaith partner in humanitarian relief aid work. Carol Stern, you can only see the top of her head. She's the president and was the president and CEO of UNICEF USA. We've cooperated for years, millions of dollars with UNICEF USA on tetanus elimination programs. Head of Episcopal Migration Ministries, the State Department. We had a top-notch panel to show not only what we were trying to do, but to show this cooperation. Because of that panel, which was done in conjunction with Felipe's office, the Department of Global Communications, we were able to work very closely with the DGC when it came to, when it came to having the UN Civil Society Conference in Utah last year, which was tremendous. 5,000 people came. Sharon Eubank spoke. Bishop Koch spoke at the closing plenary. We were able to invite guests to a concert with the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. The president of the General Assembly was able to tour Welfare Square and to see our humanitarian efforts. We were able to show a lot of the good things that we're doing and the cooperation that we're doing. But that's not all. I feel like a telemarketer now, but wait, there's more. I also oversee the work of the UN in Geneva. And at the same time as we've been increasing our footprint here in New York, we've also been increasing our footprint in Geneva. Last September, we were able to do our first ever panel at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and be able to make a name for ourselves. One of the attendees after that panel, who had kind of been a little slow to want to work with us, she went to that panel and she said, "Oh, you all really are a force to be reckoned with." And since then has worked much more in collaboration with us, because again, we're trying to show forth a good effort, and then bigger and bigger things come. And so I've been really, really, really happy with the progress that we've made over the last 6 years.
That is great. Thank you, Ryan, for sharing all this information. It's very valuable for everyone that will be watching currently this video. I know that we are struggling right now due to this pandemic, this COVID pandemic, and how has this COVID affected the work that you do?
So there's two sides of that. One of it is LDS Charities, right? And the work of Latter-day Saint Charities around the world. With the start of COVID, there was definitely a major shift within Latter-day Saint Charities to be involved in COVID projects, to either mitigate the effects of COVID or to work on prevention efforts for COVID, whether that was providing PPE or whether it was, offsetting some other needs that were in the countries. I just took a look at the latest spreadsheet with all of our projects that we've done. The grand total is 150 countries and just over 900 projects that we've been a part of in just the last 8 months. So it's been a Herculean effort in a lot of ways, to get all those projects approved, to get all those projects funded, etc. I personally have been able to be involved in a few of those projects. I had a number of diplomats reach out to me here and say, "Hey, is there any way that you could help my country?" And then try to pitch those proposals back to Salt Lake City and see how it fits with all the other requests that are coming in, etc. But as a humanitarian organization, just like other humanitarian organizations, there's been a great need. And I've been really impressed with the way we've been able to fill that over the last months. As far as the work here in New York is concerned, I actually had, at the very start in March, I had actually traveled to Geneva to attend the Human Rights Council. And I got to Geneva, I landed, took a shower, went to the United Nations campus there, sat down in my seat, and literally about 30 minutes later, there was an announcement that all meetings were canceled for the rest of the week because of COVID. And so we didn't realize at the time how dire it would be. We cobbled together a few other meetings. We canceled our own event that we had planned, and tried to, make the best of a bad situation. Came back here to New York and found that everything was shutting down fast. And so the United Nations has by and large been shut down to non-governmental organizations since the middle of March. And so how do you continue that engagement, right? There's a lot of Zoom meetings, there's a lot of virtual engagement happening, a lot of webinars. And, on the surface, they're frustrating because you can't have the casual conversations. You can't have the same kind of networking opportunities that you do with live events. Seeing your friend across the room, chatting with them for 5 minutes, setting up a lunch, saying, "Hey, we should really work together on this," etc. Zoom doesn't really provide that in the same way. On the other hand, something that I found really fascinating is that it's opened up the possibility to get engaged in a lot more ways than we have before. I'll give you one example. Most people know the G20, the big intergovernmental summit that happens. But alongside the G20, there's other 20s. There's an interfaith 20, there's a civil society 20, the C20, etc. And so with the C20, which is the civil society space, I decided to throw my hat in the ring and propose doing an event. Why not, right? It took place in Saudi Arabia, but because we weren't traveling anywhere, because it was virtual, we could do an event. It was approved. Who knew? And so we did this event based largely on the event we did at the Human Rights Council last September, but on the need for faith-based organizations and governments to collaborate together to promote educational opportunities. One of our speakers was from Sierra Leone, one was from Geneva, one was here in New York. Sharon Eubank, the president of Latter-day Saint Charities, moderated out of Utah. I felt sorry for her because she had to get up at like 4:30 in the morning. But we were able to have this panel from all over the world at the same time because we didn't have to travel anywhere. And so it ended up being a really, really great event, a really impactful event, at least for me personally. We had about 150 people from the conference attended, and most of those people had non-Western names. Like I said, the C20 took place in Saudi Arabia, and so it was an audience that we never would have reached, really, had we not been able to, had we not had the shift to the virtual engagement. So on the one hand, you don't have the same kind of interaction, but on the other hand, it's opened up a lot more possibilities for broad-based and diverse representation from a global audience.
You know, you're totally right. I think that sometimes we have to think of what we call it outside the box, right? I mean, what are we going to do now since I'm not able to take you out to lunch and do this and do that? And it's been very challenging working with technology. Sometimes it works. Thank heavens that today, you know, as you know, an hour ago I was very frustrated trying to even to connect via Zoom. So when it
Well, then
works,
I was moderating my own webinar this morning, and all of a sudden my internet cut off, and so
I was at,
yes.
I was at a conference call with a colleague in India. The same thing happened, right? She lost connection, but anyhow, it's interesting the experience that you share of what actually took place. Where were you when COVID hit, right? And I
Right.
love that story that you share, and I think that's going to happen in the future. We always talk about where were you when 9/11 happened, right?
Mhm.
So I think we're going to start talking about where were you when COVID hit, right?
Yeah.
I think that's gonna move on. You know, you have indicated that you have interns coming from many
Mhm.
directions, and gratefully, I'm very happy to hear that you have had Utah Valley University students working out of your office, and has been a successful experience.
Yes,
That's
they've
terrific.
been fantastic.
That's awesome. My question to you is, what role can we play as an academic institution or even civil society to support and promote uh, and to align, I think, the 2030 agenda with items
Mhm.
that you folks are doing, as well as what the United Nations are doing?
So I don't know if Felipe talked about it last week. I don't recall him talking about it, so I apologize if I'm a rerun. But there's a term that they float at the United Nations often, which is glocal. It's a combination of global and local. Um, and when I think about what people can do, what individuals can do, what academic institutions can do, it's that term, to think globally but act locally. You know, we have the sustainable development goals, and you know the first step is knowing what those sustainable development goals are, right? And looking at those. But what are things in your own city? What are things in your own town? What are things that you can be doing locally to support that, right? I think of Sustainable Development Goal 11, which is sustainable cities, right? And peaceful cities, inclusive cities. What are we doing now post-election to come together in a spirit of unity, right? We don't have to be doing these huge projects. We can do something on our street. Reducing poverty. There's poverty in the United States. There's a lot of poverty in the United States. What can we be doing locally to support that? And when we're doing that, we really are supporting the Sustainable Development Goals for the entire world, even just by working in our own neighborhood in the United States. It's not necessarily something that we have to help the developing world do. We need help here in the US too. And so if we think globally but act locally, we are contributing to the 2030 agenda.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm going to take a few seconds here to look at a couple of questions that we have had from
Okay.
those that are actually following this presentation live. And we have a common friend by the name of Felipe Capo that actually asked a question of all people. But he's saying, what is the main challenge that LDS Charities and the New York Office for Public and International Affairs of the Church faces to carry out his work and mission besides COVID-19?
I, I would say that the main challenge for our office is the same challenge for the church writ large. And that's that there is a lot of misunderstanding about our faith and about who we are as a people, right? Especially for Latter-day Saint Charities, because of the fact that the church has such a robust proselyting team, right? 60,000 missionaries worldwide, et cetera. Even in the midst of COVID, people are going on missions and doing things. People assume that our humanitarian aid is being given with proselyting in mind. Like, we will give you 5,000 wheelchairs if you give us 20 visas for missionaries, right? And it's not that way at all. It's not that way. It's completely separate. And my office is 100% non-proselyting. Like, we are not allowed. And so really what it is kind of misunderstandings about who we are as a people, about what we're trying to do. And so overcoming a lot of those misunderstandings, showing that we really are in good faith just providing aid because we want to help people, and don't expect anything in return. And the way we overcome a lot of those barriers is through conversation. And so that's part of the advantage, and it's part of why we have a full-time presence here in New York, is because we're tasked with having those conversations, with meeting people, with showing people, with talking to people that we really want the same point B, if you will, and that we're all trying to work towards that point B together.
Interesting. Yeah, Ryan, we have another question in regards to the great work that you folks do and aiding and supporting many different nations through the humanitarian arm of
Mm-hmm.
church, as you indicated. One of the questions is, how is that funded? Is that funded through members, tidings coming from members, fast offerings, humanitarian programs, investments? How individuals, even from outside of the faith, can contribute or can support the initiatives that LDS Charities are conducting throughout the world?
Mm-hmm. So our funding is pretty unique. One of the things that's interesting is because when I talk about the scope and the breadth of our work at the United Nations, many people don't believe us. They say, no, if you were really that big, if you were really doing that much work, we would have known about you by now. And part of the reason why they don't is because we're entirely self-funded. We're not getting government grants. We're not competing for the same amounts of money, which force collaboration with other organizations often. In fact, 80% of the budget for Latter-day Saint Charities is made up of donations of $25 or less. Which means that it's a lot of people all around the world that are like, I got 20 extra bucks this morning. They put it on their slip under humanitarian aid. I can give $20 to humanitarian aid. When I mentioned that statistic to my parents, in fact, they said, oh, I guess my little donation does make a difference. And since that time, they've been donating 20 bucks a month to humanitarian aid. But 80% of those donations are just people, just small donations, just people trying to say, okay, I got a little extra money. I know LDS Charities does a good job. We're gonna support that. What I will also say is that 100% of the donations to Latter-day Saint Charities is used for humanitarian aid. The overhead, the full-time staff work, for example, is paid for through other financing means for the church, which means that when you donate to Latter-day Saint Charities, you're not paying for staff time or anything like that, and your money does go to humanitarian aid.
Ryan, we're talking about the great work that you do in New York. And what I'm coming to, you know, as you mentioned, there's a lot of individuals that don't know too much about the LDS Charities. For those of us that actually reside here in the state of Utah, believe it or not, how can we become a little more involved when it comes to LDS Charities work?
In Utah, you mean?
Yes. It's interesting. We're learning about LDS Charities from New York.
Right. Some of it is donation, of course, but every once in a while there's projects. Just Serve falls under Latter-day Saint Charities as well. So if you go to justserve.org and look for service opportunities, you're getting involved with Latter-day Saint Charities. They put out a call during COVID to sew masks, and they got 3 million masks sewn. And largely that was in Utah. That every once in a while there's calls to do things, but then again, thinking globally but acting locally, there are ways to serve and help people even where you are in Utah. There's some of the Latter-day Saint Charities programs are doing refugee support, English classes, etc. And so looking for some of those opportunities. I'm not sure exactly where they are because again, I'm here in New York. I'm not in Utah. but looking for some of those opportunities to help in some of those efforts happen even in Utah.
We have maybe less than 30 seconds, but we do have a question. Someone asking, what has been the most fulfilling project you have been involved with?
I think really going back to it, you know, I said I'm most proud of the trajectory, right? Here. I think that if I had to pick a single project, it would probably be the Focus on Faith briefing with Sister Bingham. Other things have happened since then that have also been very fulfilling, but I view that briefing as a turning point. A turning point both in terms of Salt Lake City's estimation of the office, a turning point in our ability to engage here. And so really I'm most proud of having played a small role in getting that briefing together.
Thank you, Ryan. I know that we're out of time. I know there are a couple other questions in our comment box on Facebook. So later on throughout the day, if you have a minute, if you want to review some of those, maybe answer, that probably those individuals will be very, very grateful for that. Again, thank you, Ryan, and to everyone for helping make this successful event. Please join us for our next Global Dialogue Tuesday at 11 o'clock as we welcome Senator Curtis Bramble, Chairman of the International Relations Trade Committee at the Utah State Senate. To see the full schedule of Global Dialogues or previous video programs, simply access our website at www.uvu.edu/global. As we sign off today, choose to be a global citizen. Thank you and have a wonderful day. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you so much, Baldomero, for the opportunity.